In this lesson, we will continue with our first LEQ, looking at how the life and eventually the message, or the Quran, but for now, the life of Muhammad shaped Islam, understanding that history and religion are closely connected. Each affects the others. Religions shape the way people think and act, which has an impact on historical events. Historical events shape our culture, which is a part of our thinking and beliefs, and so it will have that same impact as new religions emerge and as existing religions change. And so this is a back and forth relationship and not just one cause leading to another effect. In this lesson, you will need to have out what we're now calling handout number 3, which looks like the paper on screen. That is our encyclopedia text on the life of Muhammad. As a reminder, you will have homework assignments this week. You're looking to complete the blue paper, which is an introduction to the unit for your family members. You need to make sure a family member is able to read the front and sign the bottom, and contact me if there are any questions. The students are supposed to add 4 comments to the back of that paper, which is the same selection from the NCSS report that we looked at towards the beginning of the year. I put an example comment on there so that you can see what you're striving for when you're annotating. Your main overarching goal is to show me that you are thinking while you read. You do that by summarizing parts of the text or asking questions, making connections to other things that we have learned, or just in general reflecting on what's happening in your head as you grapple with the ideas. The other assignment is the usual routine with our TAN test reflection papers. You need to make sure that your family is reading the front to see how you did, and check marking if you're going to retest or not, then signing the front of the paper. You need to make sure you've done this QR code, which will take you to a Google form to watch a video and answer some questions. Some of you finished that earlier if you finished the test early, but it's important to double check. Last week, early in this lesson, we previewed this entry using the heading that's here, the example of the text, and especially the citation. What do you already know about this source? Pause for a few seconds to think. Consider which 4 of these terms would apply to the source. Hopefully, you're thinking about these 4. That once we see that this is coming from World Book, we know that it is an encyclopedia, and that really determines the rest of these options. You could peel it apart by using the date or looking at the way they're presenting some of the facts. But as we get familiar with some of the major documents that historians use, we should be able to start categorizing them simply by our past experience. It's been a few days since we last engaged with this text. Earlier in the lesson, we looked at the first few paragraphs. Think about these 3 questions in red to remind yourself of what we examined. If you can, pull the answers out of your brain. If you need to, look back at your handout. Hopefully, you're thinking about the 6th century, so around 570 CE. Remember that we use sort of the end of his life and some of his final messages as the beginning of Islam in 630, though some of it is starting even earlier than that. We'll look at a timeline in a moment to see how that fits into context. Number 2, you might have remembered that he worked as a camel driver, which is a type of person who works on a trade route, caring for and moving along the camels that were used as vehicles at the time. He eventually married a wealthy merchant, so one of the people who owned the businesses operating on those trade routes. And as a result of both of those things, he traveled a lot, and that brought him into contact with other cultures. You know, when we think of Mecca, located here in southwest Saudi Arabia, this is where Muhammad grew up. It's where Islam is beginning. And so we can see this darker red is kind of where the first followers of Islam established themselves. Muhammad is traveling outward from this area, though, and coming up into this region that we call the Holy Land, where Israel and Palestine exist. At the time, cities of Damascus and Jerusalem are major trade centers that Muhammad would have visited. And so he is encountering, as a young adult, these other faiths and cultures, which have a big influence on his thinking. Thinking of how it fits into geography is important. It's also useful to look at how events fit into the chronological events. And so we should recognize sort of how these pieces break down. A lot of the dates on the screen here are ones that we have reviewed. Looking at Christianity beginning in the 1st century CE, eventually becoming part of the sort of popular religion of the time in the 300s when Rome adopts it, and then Rome falls. And so we've been looking at this early Middle Ages in our previous unit. We're going to see how Islam begins in the same time period, and then how this conflict with the Crusades sort of begins to create a lot of changes. Our goal with this period was to finish marking up the text that we were looking at in social studies earlier in the lesson. You're going to be given prompts of things to highlight, dotted, underline, or underline, and then you're going to have a chance to eventually check that against my key. I'll include the rest of the instructions for those pieces in the email, but the goal is for you to get all the way through the marking to the end and then complete a short quiz to practice what I consider some of the biggest ideas from that text.